All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. And for those just joining, greetings to you too as we begin session 3 of our Auto Theories Forum. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the MIT Press, I'd like to thank you for joining us for what has been a very fruitful, very stimulating day so far. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. And as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would love to take this moment in acknowledgement. This session is titled Politics, Communities, Solidarities. It will be moderated by Alex Brostoff and Vilashini Cooppan, with guest appearances by Erica Richardson and Elda María Román. This session asks, what communities have given rise to Autotheory's voices, and what are its preoccupations and politics? This session introduces Autotheory's roots in BIPOC, crip, neurodivergent, feminist, queer, and trans writing. Erica Richardson is a Black feminist scholar and assistant professor of English at Kenyon College at the University of New York. Her research focuses on Black women's literature, Black intellectual history, and African American drama. She has published work in the American Studies Journal and is working on the forthcoming book titled How Black Women Count, Black Womanhood, Literary Culture, and Black Social Life. We're also going to be joined by Elda María Román. She is an associate professor of English at USC Dornsife and studies race, class, literature, and media. She is the author of Race and Upward Mobility, which examines class dynamics in African American and Mexican American literature, television, and film from the 1940s through to the 2000s. Dr. Román has been awarded the 2024 Gulf Coast Prize in Nonfiction for her essay Qualifying Exams, and is a Pushcart nominee for her nonfiction piece House of Silences in the prose category. So please join me now in welcoming Alex Brostoff, Vilashini Cooppan with Erica Richardson and Elda María Román. A great pleasure and an honor having you all with us here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Peter. And of course, thanks to you and to City Lights for hosting us and making possible this virtual space of a really vibrant conversation. Thanks to the MIT Press, our editor and our publicists. And thanks to you both, Elda María and Erica, for being with us today. So in our last session, we were speaking with Laura Cernat, who studies biofiction, autotheory, and autofiction, about the relationships between those particular genres, which of course bleed into one another. And also we talked about the kind of self that those specific genres kind of summon into being, where it is located, what some of its markers are, what stylistic registers it emerges in. And we want to keep that self in our mind in this session, but also to think about how that self can be periodized, specifically periodized to moments of resistance, moments of contesting dominant narratives, moments of emergence. We are also interested in how these selves, via some kind of autotheoretical mode, are producing not simply selves but communities, and we're interested in the interplay between that. So first, I'd like to ask you both to talk about what communities, either now or in an earlier historical moment, have produced auto theory. Obviously, don't tell us all of them, but tell us the ones you're interested in. And tell us also, what are the preoccupations and politics of these auto-theoretical communities, or communities produced auto-theoretically? So let's start there. Erica, do you want to go first?
Sure. So a community that I think a lot about in terms of auto theory is community of women of color, very often Black feminists, but I say women of color also very deliberately because the kind of origin for auto theory, for me at least, is this bridge called My Back. So we're thinking of Chicana, we're thinking of Black women, we're thinking of queer women, we're thinking across this BIPOC organization. And for me, the auto-theoretical thrust of this work, of this bridge called My Back, entails this recognition of intersectionality, but also how intersectionality requires a voice. And for me, like that's the moment where we start to get into like the auto, when we start to think about it's not just knowing that race, sexuality, class, difference informs our experience and our understanding of the world, but actually speaking to that experience as another register or depth. And the politics of that, I think, like with this bridge called My Back, when it first came out, was quite fraught. You know, this sense of like, can we actually speak into existence the way we are thinking together, and also speak to our very sort of specific and niche understandings of self. And it's like I've had moments where I've like flipped through the book and there are certain pieces like that really speak out to me, thinking about like the color of my mother's skin, and having that phrase, having that language actually be a source of theorizing and thinking about the world. And the reason I highlight this as being politically fraught is because there is a way in which we think of only certain registers and certain sort of vocabularies and experiences as speaking to theory. And so what I find community building is very often this sense of the quotidian, the mundane, and how you actually say it to yourself, or you say it at the kitchen table. That also is generative. And it was something that I could not recognize for myself. I always thought I was just brainstorming into my big sort of like intellectual thrust. I'm just chatting at home with my mom about what I'm studying, and she's like, "What are you doing? Like, what are you working on? What do you mean when you say you want to know like how does she sort of go about the day? How did grandma go about the day, taking care of the home in various ways, going to work, having those moments where all these obligations can't necessarily be fulfilled, and how that's posing a critique on the world around us." And the sense of deference or even dismissal that would entail. Like, I'm not really doing this thing that you say I'm doing. I'm not really bringing into being, through this oral tradition of sitting and talking with you, Erica, this set of ideas. And how often I would have to push back against that and say, actually, you are doing something, and that's okay. Like, it is okay that you are producing a body of knowledge, but it's like the politics of that. I think it's not only about how others receive it, but how like subjects themselves are willing to or resistant to actually claiming their knowledge production. And so I'll pause there just to kind of open up how I'm thinking about these communities and how they form. They're already in existence, but there's often on both, whether they're reception or even this of self-acknowledgement, a fraught process of actualization or affirmation.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you brought up this vital question of the politics of knowledge production and the ways in which that organizes this larger realm in which folks are negotiating not only what theory is, but the question of access to it. Does it count if X or Y person does it, right? There are all these subtle and not so subtle, in fact, incredibly broad strokes, proprietary claimings theory. And it makes me think of Audre Lorde and of thinking about the ways in which the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. So it raises the question too, which I hope we'll get to later, of in what way is auto-theoretically voiced theory not the master's tool, right? And why is that important to the kind of dismantling and claim laying that we see precisely, Erica, in the tradition you just sketched out? But let's hear as well from Elda María.
Yeah, well, to build on that last point and also on Erica's comments, I think about how this bridge called My Back was so radical in being the first time Latina, Asian American, Black women, Native women were all anthologized together, right? And so even, you know, writing against capitalism and racism's technologies for separating and dividing groups, right? Like they were writing together, and it was such a deliberate practice in the editorial aspect, but also the publication history to, you know, perform the politics it was trying to enact, right? I think of how also writing against the master's tools required self-interrogation, right? To acknowledge internalized racism and classism, misogyny, right? All of the ways in which we might be complicit in these structural conditions of violence. But then also coming to first person narrative, right? If we are conditioned not to value our stories or to, and, you know, several of these contributors and many who produce auto theory today are trained in institutions that are so hostile to, you know, marginalized voices. And so writing in the first person, you know, was a huge contribution. And it's something that I see in myself and also in my students, because I teach grad students at USC who are both in who are writing critical dissertations and creative writing dissertations, and writing in the first person, but that acknowledges the contributions of others, is something that we are rarely trained to do very well. I think one of the challenges, because these endeavors tend to be bifurcated for the most part, is, you know, academics tend to be trained to explain, while creative writers are trained to produce emotional effects. And so learning how to do both well for political purposes is something that this Bridge Called My Back models so well. And I also think of a contemporary example because, you know, like I drew so much inspiration from these 1980s writers. But, you know, there are so many women and so many creative writers across like fields who are doing this kind of radical work. And a contemporary example of community building for me was when Tracy McMillan Cotton and Roxanne Gay had a writing retreat for listeners of their podcast, Here to Slay. And it was like hundreds of people went to North Carolina, and it was like a 3-day writing retreat, basically, where we attended workshops like how to write through trauma, you know, how to write in the first person, how to trust what you know without feeling like you need to constantly cite yourself. So I think like this tradition of having to write against, you know, our even internalized dispositions to not foreground the self in relation to others is something that it's an ongoing struggle.
Totally. I mean, it's so, it's such a fraught process, to use Erica's term, right? Of questioning, like, how do I write back against the structures that have produced me? And that writing back against those structures, what will it mean to build coalitions? And I feel like that's kind of been like the underlying thing we've been talking about here. And of course, central to this bridge is, you know, coalition building. But, you know, like, going back to Erica, you called this the fraught process of actualization. And for me, that really, you know, that we see that concentrated within the title, right? This bridge called my back, right? So the act of bridging is a kind of material labor that is embodied, right? And it commits violence against the body, right? If the bridge is one's back, that means that others are treading over it, literally stepping on it, right? So I mean, I bring this up in thinking, and Elda María, you already kind of anticipated this question and beautifully answered it about the retreat. But I'm really interested in thinking about the legacy of this bridge and how it, like, who and where we see this work continuing today. And I think you gave a great example there. And I'm wondering if we can think collectively of what other kinds of coalition building we're seeing with and through auto theory. So not just what communities produce auto theory, but like, are there examples of ways that we're seeing auto theory also produce community and materialize it, despite its fraughtness. You know, where do we see this legacy continuing today?
So this is it's an excellent question, and I'm going to come at it sideways because I don't want to make too much of a claim on the direct ways in which like auto theory prompts like people to keep creating auto theory. But I think when I'm sidestepping it, what I'm also trying to say is that the name itself, or like this act that we're calling auto theory, or both the genre, but also the process of enacting it, is something that I think people are doing very creatively, but also like typically under the pressure of being embodied subjects that are marginalized. And I say that to say that auto theory happens in other places that doesn't always take up the label or the name. And so I will say this is a little bit of my, like, this is my approach to slash thinking about it. I would not claim to say that everybody approaches auto theory this way, but going back to Elda's example, it's like not too long ago, I saw that there was an art installation in Eddington, North Carolina, where Harriet Jacobs had written Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And I initially saw the art piece was made in a courthouse. So I convinced my mom, like, let's go down there. I just want to see what happens. It's a 3-hour drive, long journey, but like so fruitful at the end because we get there and it just so happens through this act of journeying, through this act of like trying to find out more about this project, I run into the curator, and we end up going on the same path that this larger consensus of Black women scholars and creatives went on to find Harriet. So they're walking the same path that she walked as a young woman, as a young enslaved woman who was constantly trying to navigate getting away from the hands of her master. And it's like walking that same path produced a series of commentary, creative works, including what was in the courthouse, that all ended up being published in like Southern Culture magazine journal. But when I think about like that entire sort of journey from me singularly finding out that there was something speaking to my interest, seeing this artwork, seeing other ways of thinking about what's the legacy of this particular woman and how she thought about her own embodiment as an enslaved subject, but also someone who's able to write another sense of self. I'm brought on this journey and then I end up kind of recreating it, or at least entering a path where I too am thinking about what are the material realities that shape the way we think about the world. How do we sort of arrive at an understanding of a foremother? And I think that's something that's very often like a part of auto theories, maybe like, at least in my feeling, like exciting citational practice where you end up following someone else by virtue of a connection, by virtue often of an intertextuality that like doesn't completely, it's not completely fulfilled on its own. It requires a bit of a venture. And so when I think about these communities forming, very often I think people are doing things that have auto-theoretical thrust and purpose, or at least production, but they don't always know that they're doing it. And at least from my perspective, that's an exciting thing to consider within this sort of tradition / critical approach to thinking and reading the self and the world, because it means like there are always going to be new sites cropping up where we least expect it. And I'm going to pause there because I realize I've been talking for a hot minute.
Yeah, I know. I love that answer. And what comes to mind in thinking about all the diffused forms that auto theory manifests, right? I think of internet culture, and it definitely enables vulnerability, but auto theory models a critical vulnerability, right? It's like you are constantly self-interrogating, and also acknowledging, paying homage, and building upon previous legacies of activism and coalitional building. And I think of how people see Gen Z as like the most like progressive, or like with a lot of optimism, right? Like that they are the most politically astute and hold a lot of promise, in these dark times that things are getting better. They are using the vocabulary and frameworks of intersectionality and auto theory, and they might not even know where they originally came from, but like their internet culture circulates and amplifies engagement with these frameworks of analysis. And so it's hard to pinpoint like an exact, like, this is the community that's, implementing auto theory in like their political platform, but like we see the signs of it, right? In how people speak and are also seeing themselves in relation to others in more vulnerable ways.
Hmm.
Well, and I love, Elda María, that you're thinking about this category of vulnerability. It's making me think about a whole different set of affective registers of auto theory that are they're not specific to thinking about Black, women of color, feminist, trans, queer traditions of auto theory, but they, they are there. And so it's making me want to understand a little bit more if we can imagine some of the hallmarks of what you're describing really as, we could call it a strain of thought or auto theory. I mean, I think Alex and I believe it is auto theory itself, that there aren't sort of mainstreams and smaller rivers and things like that. But I kind of want to catch hold of this particular raft and think, what makes this, what causes this to hold together as something
Mhm.
we would understand as auto theory. And so this is not just this bridge called my back, but maybe it's thinking about Lord, maybe it's thinking about Moraga and Anzaldua's other work, it's thinking about Carmen Machado, it's thinking, I think it's thinking about Jean Marine Staples and Adrienne Brown and Pauline Gumbs, it's so can we maybe do a little bit of that? And maybe one of the things we're doing along the way is pushing back at what has become over the last decade a fairly white middle class academic auto-theoretical writer whose works have become pretty canonic for the field itself.
What comes to mind is how experimental auto theory is. And even writing that delves into the personal and the past, it's so speculative too, right? And imagining other ways of being. And often the writers themselves are struggling or at an impasse, and that's what leads them to produce this kind of writing. In the earlier session, Alex, or I don't remember who mentioned it, but that it often comes from grief and despair, right? Like a desire for an otherwise, even in one's life. But for the world at large. And so, experimenting with different tools, narrative tools, theoretical tools, to just come to new ways of seeing and being. I think that's what I value so much from auto theory.
And just building on that, so one hallmark for me, and we've kind of covered it a little bit earlier by virtue of the different introductions and questions. I've been thinking a lot about how auto theory often arises from embodied knowledge. And not only is it, and when we say, these embodied subjects that are producing auto theory and that they're marginalized, I like to add on, because it's helped me find them, they're often exhausted. Because it is exhausting to actually lay bare the intimacies and the discourses involved in trying to constitute oneself as a subject and as a self in the world, when there's so much coming at you to destabilize that. And so when I've been thinking about kind of these recent, and it's actually not that recent, it's over 10 years now, but I actually have been thinking a lot about Claudine Rankin's Citizen. This is a work that I think about as auto theory, but particularly representing a hallmark of auto theory with exhausted bodies, exhausted from the process and the praxis of trying to embody citizenship and be Black. You know, like that keeps happening over and over again. And it was especially resonant for me recently. And this is slight like pop culture plug, but hey, if we're talking auto theory and intertextuality, we can reach out to all sorts of things. I ended up thinking about Citizen a lot because of the chapter or the section that focuses on Serena Williams, and how in the 2012 Olympics, after she won, she did the crip walk a little bit in celebration, and that sparked so much outrage. And Rankin really mediates on this and thinks about how Serena has to become Serena again. She has performed a kind of transgression in the expression of self that's also not the self that's meant to be legible in the world. And then for my pop cultural moment, it's like I'm thinking about the Super Bowl and how like that was a means of performing and sort of like proving, or not reproving, but like performing her subjectivity again in response to the critique and the backlash and the layers of discourse put upon her that she wasn't actually owning. And so, yeah, I think like in our contemporary moment, especially with like these, going back to Elda's point, like the way that we have a different social and political climate and another generation that is sort of perhaps even a primed audience for receiving these kinds of moments of, you thought you knew who I was, but actually let me perform that again. Let me let me introduce myself again. And I think that's a really intriguing way of sort of mapping and tracking like these moments that in which auto theory blossoms, when embodied marginalized subjects recognize that there's a discourse being layered onto them, and how they respond to that, whether it be via the text, via the memoir and the writing, or via the performance of self that is embodied, like dancing on stage.
I'm so grateful to you both for bringing performance and performativity into the conversation, because I think that's actually been absent from our prior few sessions. You know, Erica was just talking about, performing the self, right? Again and again in an iterative kind of way. And Elda María, earlier on, you were talking about the ways that This Bridge Called My Back performs the politics that it was trying to enact. Or does perform the politics that it enacts. And I think it would be really interesting for us to kind of like linger on this notion of like, what does auto theory perform and how, right, formally? And I think we've already kind of touched on intertextuality and the politics of citation. Erica, you mentioned embodied knowledge. So, I mean, I'm wondering, like, from a formal perspective, if we could think together about like what are some of the features through which auto theory performs a self that, is inextricably bound to the communities that produce it, that link that I to the we. And I'll invite both of you, as we think about form, to talk about the form in your own work. I know you're both of you are actively bridging academic studies of auto theory with creative practices of it. So I want to think about, not only the forms through which we read auto theory, but the forms through which you're also writing it.
Yeah. In thinking about the performative mode of even modeling a kind of critical reading for readers, I mean, that is important to me as an educator. And so in writing auto theory myself, I'm working on a collection of essays about fear, how people deal with it individually and collectively. And it came out of my own grief and despair during the pandemic. But then also I realized it was like a culmination of my lifelong fear. I had to learn, because I was trained as an academic, how to write in the first person, but in a way that would speak to collective experiences. And so even like the narrator that I construct is performing a series of learning, but also unlearning. That is like something that has been modeled to us through auto theory. And also in coming to learn how to read, how to see even seemingly disparate experiences, both personal and historical, as related, right? Because if we're looking at how various systems have created our structural conditions, it's important to understand like how to read in multiplicity. Like, you know, so to give you an example, I grew up in an undocumented family, and I was always told by my parents, never open the door. And I internalized this. I realized over time as don't trust, don't tell, right? And this is part of the unlearning I had to do in order to write in the first person. But I didn't realize how, you know, that familial phrase was informed by so many histories that were intersecting, right? That would lead my parents to not trust in the state, whether it was in Mexico or in the US. Right? How safe one feels to open the door depends on one's trust in one's environment and in the state. And I have been inspired by writing like Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, Tracy McMillan Carmen's Thick, which also incorporate humor. Because, you know, a lot of this writing is about heavy stuff. And even like in writing about fear, I don't actually want to write in a way that scares away people. You know, I think we're dealing with enough fear. And so I like that, you know, in their constructions of a self, a performative analytical self, they incorporate a lot of humor to lighten the heaviness and to remind people that, you know, as much as important as it is to, you know, read and understand, you know, these material conditions, we also have to find moments of joy and levity as a way to just, you know, to survive in these times.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Elda. I'm excited to read your work. Not only does it sound beautiful, but you also are helping me get at my own response to this question. What does it mean to kind of write with a auto-theoretical practice? And I do think it's about ushering in a capacious range of knowing, the sensory, the memory, bringing it in is a way of sort of building up that auto-theoretical practice into that work. And as you were sort of giving us this glimpse, I was thinking to myself that for my own accord, it's like, I think my entry into auto theory involved actually desiring intimacies that may not have already been there between myself and kind of the big names that I always kept reading about early on in my education and throughout my career. It's also the reason why I was so drawn initially, or when my first reading of the Argonauts was these moments of reading a work and having affect be my intellectual response. And very often I would then have to revise that affect. Like, this makes me laugh. This makes me feel like a deep sense of relation. This moment reminds me of a terrible breakup I had. And it would be in my notes, it would be in my marginalia, because I knew I could remember a phrase or a section a lot better if I could just hold on to a feeling that went with it. For myself, and I talk about it a little bit in the volume in Auto Theories, like when I read the Argonauts, I immediately started thinking of Motown music. I started thinking about I'll Take You There, because I could feel the future speculation inherent to that work. But not only that, the act of reading it made me feel like I could open that up, and that was also part of my critical approach and valuable. Very often when I read some works, and I try to sort of dissuade my students from following the same path I fell down, of what you feel and think about a set of ideas might actually be your critical contribution or your critical way of engaging it and expanding upon it, a way of making these philosophies, these theories, not just part of this ivory tower of information that you're supposed to absorb and reproduce, but actually it could become part of yourself. And I think one of the links to that is by acknowledging that sensory moment as being part of like a dialogue, of a connection. So when you were saying like, you know, it's not just fear, it's also humor. It's like, that's not just an aspect of your style and approach. It's also a way of thinking through these emotions that are not quite as disparate as we may want to frame them as, and actually really getting into the complexity and the nitty grittiness of like, when you recall like, you know, that moment of like grappling with trust, there is a way of getting closer to that idea. And like you mentioning humor being a part of it, again, it's like, it kind of breaks down these silos of affect and connection that I think is inherent to auto theory itself. So all that is to say, like, I've had my own fears. Most of my fears have involved like reading something and having an excess of an emotional response, in my own opinion, sometimes feeling like, oh man, this is really white. Oh man, this is really like heterosexual. I don't know, like it sounds like a good idea, but I don't know if I can see other communities or perspectives within it. And then instead of just saying like, oh, that's just my response, actually recognizing that's the critique to follow through and to expand upon. So I want to thank you for like sharing your own process, because it's helping me think further about like the things that I feel like afraid of, and a very different like social and political register, but it's like that might actually tap into the very thing we need.
I love that. That was like a craft lesson. Thank you for sharing that.
I mean, but it's like, but you gave the craft, you know what I'm saying? Like,
I'm just like, is this critical vulnerability? Like Elda María,
Yes,
I love that term. You used that term earlier, and I feel like that's what's happening in this conversation, and it's really beautiful.
absolutely. And the extraordinary inspiration that Erica has given us, that yet another mode might be the auto-theoretical playlist, right? The playlist that is inspired by the texts that are skin close, or are catalysts, or are actually points of misfitting. Is this really for me? That then become a kind of provisional fit, you know, that there's a certain, I'm thinking of Serena, there's a certain wearing and doing of these different styles through which we end up discovering the you know, the languages, right? Through which
yes.
it's possible to articulate not only self, but self in relationship to community. And so I take that moment, Erica, when you're like, oh, but isn't this too hat or too white or too, you know, middle class, or too throw in whatever, you know, critical theoretical thing feels to you like a message from another planet. And that moment is actually, I think, a starting point for auto theory. So there's one story in which it's the things that you read, and they were yours, right? They were speaking with you and for you and as you. But then there's equally this other set of texts that occasion the misfit. And I think it's interesting to think about how auto theory is negotiating between both of those. So it's not simply an archive of what's you, right? Because that would be a sifting mechanism that would fundamentally leave us the same. I don't know. I mean, I'm throwing that out as a question to you all. That's under the larger umbrella of why do we go to these texts? You know, and I don't know if people in the chat have any questions or thoughts to add into that. We would love to hear from you, but also from our panelists.
Well, an essay I wrote that was mentioned in the intro, qualifying exams, is about my experiences in grad school. I got my PhD at Stanford in the English department. And the essay is about, broadly this question, what does it mean to qualify, in these institutions, but also in America? And how I didn't realize how much English is still a colonial endeavor, right? And asking us to, master these disciplines that are really mastering us, as socializing us into a particular way of upholding structures of power. And I recount my experiences preparing for these exams and how they were trying to test me to like uphold, certain value systems. And now as a professor, I have to grapple with what I continue to carry on, right? Because I did learn so much in grad school, but what I definitely want to leave behind. That's a perpetual question for me.
Thank you. And I see there's another question in the chat, but also Erica, if you wanted to add in before that.
Oh, I was going to say, I was kind of doing a two-step of looking into the chat and also listening to Elda's response. I think I want to also highlight, like, Vilashini, what you just said about, like, because I hadn't framed it for myself. I didn't realize I was saying it until you, like, framed it for me, that, like, it's not, auto theory is not just about, like, kind of the search and the generative moment of connecting to the theory and to the philosophy that speaks to you, but also recognizing what doesn't speak to you. And in that respect, it does make a great deal of sense to me that both Elda and I have had these moments that our confrontation with auto theory or entering an auto theoretical practice happens like in the place we're supposed to consolidate our knowledge, supposedly, and gain mastery. It happens a lot in grad school. Like that was the place in which I was like, oh, like I'm now doing this thing that it didn't like this practice, but it is about like forming a relationality to these different theories from my like subject position. And when I say these theories, I mean like I'm thinking about sort of like the hallmark of different figures that, again, are so generative, but maybe like my own confrontation yields something else. So it's like we are thinking about figures like Derrida, we are thinking about Barth, we are thinking about these figures that are sort of like the founders, or maybe, I don't know, like we might want to contest, that's a whole other conversation, really, truly, but like they're very sort of instrumental in framing like what it means to really attend to the self and theorize through intertextuality or through these multiple mediums. But it is the moment of both feeling legible, or at the very least, like recognized in the thought of others, but also completely outside of it, that like carries the auto theoretical thrust. And in that respect, it makes me like want to do a call for like auto theory to be a practice that everyone gets to engage in these formative moments. Like maybe auto theory is central to actually understanding what it means to enter the academy, not as someone who's aiming to gain mastery and reproduce the exact same like social order of knowledge, but to do something different with it.
I love that answer, Erica, so much. And it's reminding me both about your piece, Elda María, qualifying exams, and something that Alex has written, Unschooled by Theory. Is that it?
Unschooled in Theory. Well, it's funny. It's a funny Freudian slip because the piece itself is an attempt at unschooling myself. But the title is Schooled in Theory. Yeah.
Right. But I'm thinking about, yet another primal scene of graduate school as that kind of, force-fed goose moment where yes, it is one of the places in which, for many of us who are academic practitioners of auto theory, we came into close and indeed maybe relentless contact with a great deal of auto theory. And I think we all metabolized it in different ways. And now that I've been teaching graduate students for a long time, it makes me think that part of what auto theory is a reimagining of the languages of critical writing, but also a deeply pedagogical scene in which in which precisely this surfacing of the thing Alex has called critical vulnerability, and Elda has too, belongs in the space in which we enter into this dialogue with theory, right? I mean, we don't enter into it in the mode of so-called mastery, right? And indeed, I don't think that's what theory is designed to give us, right? I've got my handle on Hegel or whomever. And when I thought about having handles on people in that way, or notches in a theoretical belt, it didn't really work for me. And I want for our students, both within the academy and for people who are engaging and thinking about what is this thing called theory, to have a different way of connecting to it. So I'm curious about this pedagogical edge. I think, you're both academics, so it's also a question about what do we do with this material in the classroom? I don't know if you have thoughts or ways to tap into what you're calling this vulnerability, because it's a starting point.
Well, I find when I teach even like an American Survey course, it's, the essays by Audre Lorde on poetry and the erotic that like stand out, or like Borderlands, right? It's like students, and in the first session, when you both talked about how like I read X and it made me feel like I could write, like that is their moment, right? When they realize, oh, it could look so different and it could speak to me. And so it's like having those light bulb moments is so inspiring for me as an educator. And I think this is why I've learned over time. It's like, well, I also, given that students are interested in writing in this mode, it's like I have to learn how even to speak the language of craft, because I can teach like how to analyze, but I also want to teach how students how to produce if they are so inclined. And so as an educator, I've taken writing workshops myself, right? Like for my own writing, but also so I can learn how to like pass on these craft lessons to students.
For sure. I mean, I'm also in that same boat now, trying to learn the language of craft, like you said, because it's not just about teaching works of auto theory as literature or teaching works of auto theory as theory, but teaching it as a practice, right? As a method. I want to make sure we only have about 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we open it up to folks in the audience, and to address Julie's great question in the chat.
Yeah, Julie comments, thank you so much for the rich discussions today. I'm reminded of Gayatri Spivak, Rosie Brododi, Ellen Sixu, Luce Irgare, and especially a class I took on African-American women's history and epistemology with Angela Davis in the 90s. I imagine these theorists have inspired auto theory. Just curious if their work was influential and any thoughts about their works.
Well, I'll comment a little bit, particularly on Spivak, and it's like I'm gonna be like doing some like I'm gonna do like a throwback Thursday. Yeah, this question makes me think back to can this subaltern speak? And it makes me think about how like we don't necessarily, as far as I know, again off the cuff, like we don't refer to that particular essay as being a moment of auto theory, but I do think Spivak's work is part of a genealogy, if not a tradition. It would take a little bit more thought for me to figure that out, but at least a genealogy in which thinking about the subject position from which one can actually articulate and have authority over their own experience and not have it. And when I say authority over their own experience, I like mean this in the deepest way possible. Like this sense of what does my speaking into the world actually mean? What does it bring forth? And what are the ways in which it's constantly sublimated and put back into the same, perhaps like hegemonic conversation or idea of coloniality? And it's like when I read Can the Subaltern Speak, like it it was one of those things where it made me understand more than the anthropological like thrust of like, I want to hear from this person so I can add it in X, Y, and Z. Spivak's really understanding, I think, within the frame of a auto theory tradition. Yeah, again, that kind of like fraughtness of how does one access yeah, the subject, and when the subject can be one's own self, and like even the act of speaking and like speaking to a colonial imaginary, it's every step of the way requires like just these layers of like self-reflection, but also understanding the intervention being made. And I think that's what I always appreciated about the work. Like the act of speaking alone is not like the only important thing. It's not enough to have a record of a voice, a record of a take. It's also like speaking is supposed to be an interruption. And when I think about Spivak specifically in that essay, it's like, it does remind me like of the waves and of the resonance of that kind of disruption itself. So again, a little bit off the cuff. I wish I could like frame it with a little more like context. But I just wanted to say like the list of names, Julie, that you're bringing up, it makes sense to me. It makes a great deal of sense to me, not just because these are kind of like major figures in our feminist thought, but I think each, and again, I'm kind of looking to the chat, each one of these thinkers and writers understands the disruption that their voice is actually bringing into being, whether or not it's always kind of made hyper visible or legible in their work. I think as we receive them, it's like, yes, like the fact that you are speaking to this discourse from your subject position is an act of disruption. It's not just what you're saying. And sometimes that can be a bit burdensome. Like we don't want this sense of like, I have to bring my full self to my critical intervention. But I think these scholars are highly aware of what that entails. So they're part of that genealogy.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you for reminding us of this, what you so forcefully and correctly called disruption. And I'm thinking of, that essay was really important to me in that moment too, because it was saying there's a problem when Western theory thinks it's hearing something, the voice of the subaltern, but the only reason it could hear it is because it's speaking Western theory's language, right? Whether that be the dialect of Enlightenment humanism or the discourse of rights, or we can think about the tactics of the slave narrative. But there's something about, as you say, the disruption, the learning to listen for a speaking that is not one being done in a voice you already know, that's really important. And there's a line I love from Luce Irigaray where she says the project is to jam the theoretical machinery itself. And I think auto theory is a little bit about throwing a cog into the auto theoretical machinery, stopping it from working the way it generally works and working for those for whom it generally works, and kind of disrupting or jamming or stalling or just throwing a wrench into it that then becomes a really productive speaking otherwise. So I'm really grateful that you've both reminded of us. I thank you so much, Julie, for this thought that we have to teach not just the content, but also styles of communication, right? With humility, with kindness, with curiosity, all of that. I want to thank both of our fantastic panelists, Erica and Elda María. This has been a really important conversation for the larger constellation of auto theory. And I want to invite those of you, we're going to take a break and come back at 2:45, but our next panel will be an interview we recorded with Chris Kraus about publishers and presses and the making of auto theory. And we'll also have time after that for discussion either of that recorded interview or more broadly around things we've raised today. So thank you again. and we will see you at 2:45.
Thank you again, Erica and Elda Maria. This was amazing.
Thank you.
I hope to be able to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to offer City Lights' gratitude to the four of you for your generosity and your presence, and it means a great deal to us. And also thanks to all of you in the audience for faithfully joining us as the day has moved along. As mentioned, we have one more session coming up, Making Auto Theories, Presses, Publishers, and Popularization. And as always, today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. Our public events, our publishing program, and educational outreach are all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So thank you again, everyone. We'll see you in a short bit.